Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and today I'm going to talk about this trip around the world quilt and what I did to make it mine with 9 patch blocks. So I've had this quilt behind me for at least one video and got lots of comments on it. I've gotten some DMs. Are you not going to talk about that quilt? Tell me about the quilt. How do you do that? And all manner of questions. So the story about this quilt is this is actually a quilt that my grandmother made. My father's mother, who we called Mimi. Mimi was a quilter and a cross-stitcher and an embroiderer, and she made this quilt behind me for my parents, and it was on their bed the bulk of my childhood, and I loved it. I would sit on the bed talking to my mom and would just look at all of the colors and the patterns, and it was just intriguing and beautiful, as you can tell. So recently, my cousin's daughter, which I guess my first cousin's daughter, does that make her my second cousin? Second cousin, messaged me and said, "Your quilts remind me of Mimi quilts," which in and of itself is just the best compliment. And she asked if I would be willing to make her a quilt, which of course I was very willing, am and was. And so this quilt has actually been in my sister's keeping for many years now. And I asked my sister if I could borrow it for inspiration, because it is an inspiration. And so I got it home and I looked at it and studied it and looked at it some more and tried to figure it out. And the thing about a trip around the world quilt, and you can see it, is it's, you start off with a center point, and then it's just typically just squares, and they just are like concentric, it's almost like concentric circles, but it's diamonds made of squares. It's not on point, it's actually just straight, but it kind of feels like it's on point because of the way it makes diamonds going out. What's challenging about a trip around the world quilt is the actual construction, squares attached to squares, is not terribly hard, but you have to have I'm going to call this a ring. So like this red is a ring, this green is a ring. You have to have every ring planned out before you ever start the first one, because if you're going to do literally a true trip around the world, which is a center and then the rings just get further and further out with no repeating, you have to have the whole quilt planned out before you start, which I guess that's probably true in some way of most quilts. But like my last quilt that I made, actually that's not the last quilt, the quilt before the last quilt that I made, the Elena quilt, they were blocks. And I made each block and then arranged them after they were all made. Cannot do that at all with a trip around the world quilt. So what you have to do, and really there's not even a way to do it with a block. You could do one gigantic block, well, 4 of them. So you leave out the centerpiece, the center cross, and the center cross this way. And you could do this block, so in quadrants. And that's really the only way to break it down into small pieces. But you still have to know where you're going and lay out every one of those pieces to do it. And that feels very daunting. And in fact, actually one of my viewers, Amy, who's from America but living in Africa, loved this quilt, and actually we messaged back and forth. She's like, "How did you make that?" And the answer is, I didn't make it. So it's really a beautiful arrangement of those blocks, but it's a little bit daunting because of having to have it all laid out, and not many of us have this space to lay it all out, and it felt like, whew, my goodness. So I pondered and mulled over this for many a night, and so then I started trying to figure out what could I do to do something similar without doing exactly what my Mimi did in this quilt? And in order to do that, I did further study. So this particular quilt, the pieces are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches finished. So it probably was 1 3/4 inches, so just shy of 2 inches. So the pieces are very small, which would require, in my case, a lot of shirts, and also just the coordination of them. And that also felt like a lot. I don't know about you, I think that a trip around the world quilt is so beautiful, but they can get very busy. This one is pretty masterfully done because it's an alternating pattern, solid, pattern, solid, so there's something to anchor each ring to the next one. So this is a perfect example. So this is pink, and then a pattern that has pink and navy, and then navy. It's actually very thoughtfully and artfully done. So it's not terribly busy, but they can, especially if you do a scrappy one, which is sometimes how working with shirt fabric can feel. And I wanted to be able to do it in a way that I used that same fabric for the whole ring. So after thinking and studying and kind of almost having like lucid dreams about it, I decided, this is more than I'm willing to take on. But maybe it's doable if I mix it up a little bit and put some background fabric in between the rings. And then that led me to think about 9-patch blocks. So that was where I ended / started / ended. And I thought, I think this could be really beautiful. And the 9-patch would break up those fabrics, probably stretch my fabric budget a little bit, and not have to use quite as many colors or fabrics. So you can see for yourself, there's very little repeating. And so from this corner to that corner, however many rings that is, that's how many different fabrics there are. And that was a little bit more than I was willing to take on. So that is kind of the background of the Mimi quilt. I think it's so gorgeous. If you're interested, you can pause the video and take a good long look at it. Maybe I'll put a picture on Instagram. So if you're an Instagram person, you can pixel peep it and like open it up so you can see each row. Because some of these fabrics are just really gorgeous and really handled well from the standpoint of one color to another. But I decided this was more than I could take on. Maybe I would try a 9-patch with it. And so I'm going to take this quilt down, and then I'm going to show you what my next steps were to try to problem solve this. How can I get this without making this? So I've taken down the Mimi quilt, and this is my take on it. So what I am making, obviously have not totally made yet, is a 9-patch trip around the world. And what that allows me to do is I can work on blocks at a time and know where I'm going with them. And I'm actually constructing it, attaching it from the inside out. And you can tell this is just on my design wall. A lot of this is pinned. Some of this is sewn together, which P.S., have you ever noticed like you lay out your blocks either on a wall or your bed, or in my case, I do it on the floor a lot. And I go, oh, this is going to be so pretty. And then I think I have a handle on what it's going to look like. And then I actually sew it together, and it's 1 bazillion times better once it's all stitched together. I don't know what that is. It's like, it seems like it should be the same. But when I guess seeing all the ragged edges, I don't know. Anyway, so this is where I'm going. And you can see it really is just a checkerboard pattern. 9-patch blocks and really even a trip around the world, you don't see a lot of patterns for them because it's like, who copyrights a 9-patch quilt? I mean, it's almost like Mary Had a Little Lamb or the Happy Birthday song. It's public domain, so you can't copyright that song. It's been around so long. Same thing with 9-patch and Trip Around the World. You don't see a lot of patterns for them because they are what they are, and you can kind of figure it out on your own. But then figuring it out on your own can be a little challenging. So I could have done this just block by block, not big block, square by square. That's what I meant. Square by square, and it's like a checkerboard. But what's important about it is the actual arrangement of the colors and the fabrics. So in order to do that, I had a lot of planning. So I'm going to sit down and show you the planning that I did, and I'm going to get to use those colored pencils that everybody asks me about that are on my sewing table. I get so many questions about the colored pencils. And so here's the answer. I really do use them, and I love the way they look, and the colors make me happy. And you know, if you've watched any of my previous videos, that I like the cool color, warm color, neutral scenario. And so once I put them together in these glass jars, I liked them so much and they were pretty, so I just put them on my sewing table. But I really do use them, and this is the way. So on my table, you'll see I have gotten, and I put my yellows with the neutrals, by the way. Don't ask me why. I think because my oranges and reds, I have so many. So what I do is I get a little piece of scratch paper, and I kind of just play with the color that I'm looking for. In this case, it's this one. And if I need help visualizing what I'm planning on doing with either a colorway or a block or just an overall pattern, I pull out my color pencils. I have some graph paper, which if you have not used graph paper as an adjunct to your quilting, let me tell you, this is the stuff. I actually had my husband buy some graph paper that does not have blue lines. It's gray, because I'm such a weirdo. I didn't want to have blue lines and then have like a warm quilt and kind of it visually mess with me. I don't know. It's a thing. So you can get your graph paper and either just do your colorway on it, or you can actually do a whole block, just color it in, and it will help you see, oh, okay, that's going to work, or, ugh. The first thing that I did was color out the 9-patch squares as I had kind of envisioned it in my head, just to see if it would even look like a Trip Around the World quilt, because I didn't want to go to the trouble of starting to make it and, you know, work from that center out and it not be visible that there are rings, if you remember, rings of diamonds, so that it would have that Trip Around the World feel. And I did Google image Trip Around the World quilt with 9-patch. I did every possible search combination you could think of. And they are out there, but the way I had it envisioned in my head, I couldn't find anything like that out there on the World Wide Web. So I got out my colored pencils, and I'm going to show you. I actually did this one I'm about to show you. I did for the video. The one that I did initially, I wondered if it would look better with a gray background, and so I colored in all the gray, and then I hated it, so I threw it away. But anyway, so this is the design. This is the color. Now, it will continue out purple and then blue. Actually, the colors are right here. So if you wanted to see where I'm going with it, it's all right here. But I knew once I got to the red, before I went into that kind of hot lipstick pink, I was like, oh yeah, it's going to be good. And I kind of wanted that centerpiece to be bright. I wanted it to have that focal centerpiece and it be something bright and interesting, and then kind of go into, do like a gradient and then back out to a lighter color. We'll see if that actually comes to fruition. I got this far and did not have to go any further or farther. Just didn't have to proceed. Because I thought, oh yeah. So I don't know if you can, hopefully you can see either what's real behind me or on the paper. Before I had the blocks, I had this paper and was like, yeah, that's gonna be neat. So once you get to that stage and it's like, okay, so this is gonna be pretty. But then, oh shoot, what size do I want this thing to be? And also, as the concentric diamonds, is that a thing? Concentric diamonds get bigger, will a shirt, one shirt, carry that distance? So in order to do that, I had to actually draw out the whole quilt. So, which sounds so much harder than it actually is. So let me show you. Here it is. Here's the whole quilt. And you can see I've made dots. I'll talk about that in a second. So what I did is I took my graph paper and instead of having these big 9-patch squares like they are here, I condensed that down to one block is 4 little squares. Hopefully you can see that. I'm gonna get my little purple thing because it's such a good pointer. That is that centerpiece. And then, you know, it goes out as you go. I thought what would make sense, I did not want to do quite as small pieces as my Mimi did, not only because it's kind of an odd size, but the smaller the pieces, the more piecing you have to do. But I have made a 9-patch quilt that is still in the works. Cannot seem to see the end of it, with 3-inch squares, and they just felt a little big to me. So I decided to go with that kind of standard 2.5 by 2.5-inch square, which then really solved its own problems because I have a ruler, a binding ruler that is 2.5 inches wide, and that's kind of a nice standard. So if you were watching this and you have jelly rolls or you have 2.5-inch strips, you can do this quilt with that size. So what that meant is that if I was going to do 2.5-inch squares, then the block size would be 6-inch finished. And so I had to figure out what size quilt I wanted to make. So I just started by making a grid and figuring out just to start. So I did it by letters. You could do it any way you want to, but the center block is A, and then the next string is B and C, D, so on and so forth. Now, Trip Around the World quilt, as you know, if you really do it perfectly symmetrical, it's going to be a square. And I didn't want to make a square quilt. Now that I'm saying this out loud, I'm not even sure I remember why. I think for beds and throws that a rectangle is nicer so that you have the length to really be able to tuck under your feet. You can tell how I use quilts now as I'm saying this. I want to be able to pull it up to here and it go all the way the length of my body and over my feet and back under so that I don't have any gap air, any air gaps. But what that means then is if I made it long enough to do the whole body and underneath, then that's really, really wide. And that felt like a big commitment of time, energy. So I did the math, and if I did 13 6-inch blocks across and 15 6-inch blocks down, that would be, it's kind of right there in between a twin or a full. So it could be like a topper for a queen, or topper with a little bit of overlap on a full, or an actual twin size bed, or a really, really big throw. So that to me was kind of like right down that middle lane of what size. And I will tell you, I started off with 14 by 14, and then it didn't take me long to realize, oh, there's no center block in a 14 by 14. So it has to be an odd number. So I drew this all out, and then what I did, and I'll show you, I made this one neat. I want you to see what it really looks like when I did it. This was the real. So you can see I neatened it up a little bit. And then I got my pencil and I went back on my original and drew the 9 patches. So, so the one with 5 colored blocks and then the one with 4 and then 5, 4 and carried it out. So, but you can see that a little bit better. I used colored pencils on this one. So that center block is I call that it's a 9 patch block, but for our purposes, I call that a 5. And then the one next to it has the solid pieces are 4 of them. So hopefully you can see this correlation here. And then it goes to a 5, and then it goes to a 4, and then it goes to a 5. So drew it all out. And then I was like, I'm not sure that this big, I'm actually going to mark on this. This is the longest stretch right here. And there's a fair amount of fabric, of the solid fabric. I had made the commitment to do the background fabric from Yardage because I have a lot of white and cream fabric that I picked up at the thrift store and also at my local quilt store. And I just didn't want to have to break down that many white or cream shirts. So that was taken care of. And I was fairly certain that if I ran out of white or cream fabric, I could go buy more. But that's the thing about working with shirts. If you have a shirt that you really like, that's it. You can't go buy more. So what I needed to figure out then, now that I had this size, which is like 78 by 90, I think, if memory serves, will that one shirt carry that distance? So I picked the colorway, which that's this, and obviously what you see behind me. So I knew the yellow, obviously that's not much fabric, and the one next to it, I did not need much fabric. The one next to it isn't one of those orange linen shirts. And then as we start moving out, I had an entire shirt that had not even been broken down. So I was fairly certain I could get these, but then I felt like as I get further and further out, I might get stretched. So I did the math, and I want to show you how I did that. So I say so a lot. In order to know whether or not one shirt would carry that distance, I had to figure out what the fabric requirements for each ring would be, which sounds really complicated, and I thought it would be really complicated, but really it's just simple math. So in order to do that, each ring, which I started to say numbered by letter. I have designated with a letter alphabetically working from the center out. So A block is 5 squares, and so that's 5 squares total, and they are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. So the length of the strip that I would need to do that one little block is 12.5 inches. And then it was just a matter of doing every ring that way. So the next ring, which is I have designated as B, that is a 4 square block. So it's a 9 patch, but the actual dark color or solid color or pattern, the colored number of squares is 4. So there are 4 of them. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 times 4 is 16 total 2.5 inch squares. And then if I multiply that by 2.5 inches, the length of the strip that I would need to accomplish that is 40 inches. And so I literally just did that ring by ring by ring. So, and as you can imagine, it gets bigger as it goes out. And so 100 inches, 120 inches, 200. And then the biggest stretch is that G, which is that one that I just drew that line on. And it's 300 length inches of 2.5 inch wide strip. Does that make sense? For that particular concentric ring, I will need 24 blocks. And it is a 5 square block. So I'll need 120 total 2.5 inch squares. And as I've been quilting more, I've noticed, and quilting with shirts, sometimes I think, how many squares do I need? And sometimes I think, how many total inches do I need? So like in binding, you add the perimeter of your quilt in inches, and then that's the total length that you need. And if you're working with yardage, you know the standard is 42 to 44 inches is what yardage is. And so you can just do, well, I need 8 strips. But when you're working with shirt fabric, they're odd sizes in lengths because you're not cutting from a bolt. It requires a little mental gymnastics, cleverness, and resourcefulness. And so in just a second, I'm going to show you how to judge that. What we see is that it just gets bigger and bigger in total length, total number of inches lengthwise that you need of those strips. And then of course it gets back smaller again. If my biggest ring is 300 inches, then what I need to do, just to make sure, is get out a shirt and figure out if I can get that out of one shirt. And if I can get that ring out of one shirt, then I can do the whole quilt, because that's the biggest ring and gonna be the most of a stretch. Let me show you how to do that with your shirt. Okay, so I have my shirt, and let me tell you what I did. I figured out in my colorway which shirt was going to be the letter G. So which shirt was going to be the biggest ring. And I made sure that the shirts on either side of that ring, I had a whole shirt. So that way, if this one will do it, then the rest should be fine. So this color right here, this beautiful kind of plum mulberry, is going to be the biggest stretch. And I'm going to show you how to see for yourself if you have enough fabric, if you decide you want to do this. So I've got a 2.5 inch ruler, wide ruler. If you do not have one of these, let me just highly encourage you to get one. I use it for everything, absolutely everything. This one happens to be 21 inches, which my shirt is wider than that, as you will see, but it definitely is going to work for this process because I can kind of fudge a little bit. So what I'm going to do is actually just lay this down. Now, when you're working with 2.5 inch strips in shirts, it is helpful to know for every 5 inches you get 2 squares. So you can judge by squares or you can judge by distance. If you judge by distance, you want to round up or down to a multiple of 2.5. And the reason for that is, if I were to measure this whole thing, which this shirt, actually we'll just do that, is, so that's 21 plus 2 3/4. So it's 23 3/4. It happens when I do this measurement that this is 23 3/4, which is not a multiple of 2.5. So some of this edge, well, and it's a jagged edge, so some of those inches will be lost, if that makes sense. Only what is a multiple of 2.5 is going to be in our 2.5 inch squares. So that would be, if I stopped at 20, then I've got 8 squares. If I stop at 22.5, I've got 9 squares. But anything beyond 2.5, 22.5, up to 25 is not going to be used. So that's the caveat or the caution about doing it by inches, because you'll go, oh, I have 300 inches exactly, but some of those inches will not square up to a 2.5. So I always overshoot just to be on the safe side. So here we go. So let's say, since we know it's 23.5, we'll call it 22.5 inches for this stretch. So for my 22.5 inch strips, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so I've got 6 of those strips. So let's do a little math with the calculator. 22.5 times 6 that's 135 inches, gang. That's almost half of what we need just from the back of the shirt, and I haven't even finished the rest of the back of the shirt. It is phenomenal. How much fabric is in a shirt is unreal. Now we're getting to a more narrow part, so we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to scoot this over to the narrowest part. So it's not quite to 20, so the next multiple of 2.5 would be 17.5, which is right here. So we're going to write 17.5 times 1, 2, 3, and some change. So that's really just 3. And so that is 17.5 times 3 is 52.5 inches. So now we're up to 187.5 inches. We're trying to get to 300. So I'm going to take this away. And now let's get our shirt front, I think. Yes, shirt front. Now, it's tempting to go this way because the strips are longer. But remember, this is not for binding. We're cutting these into 2.5 inch strips. So I'm actually going to do it this way so that they're oriented the exact same. This one is, so that's 11.5, which is not a multiple of 2.5. That would be 10. So 10 inches times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's 60 more inches. So now we're at 247.5. We continue on. This one, the closest is going to be 7.5. 1, 2. Let's see. It's not really going to be 3, so we'll just leave it at that 2, but you know there's that much more. And so that's 15 more. It just keeps adding up. So 262. And now we're going to do our other side. This one is a little bit wider. It was probably where the buttons were. That one is wide enough that we're going to get a 12.5 inch strip out of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Nope. And so that was 75 inches, which puts us up to 337.5 total length strips, usable strips, and our goal was 300. So I still have all this to go, and 2 sleeves and 2 yokes. So I have plenty of fabric. Now, if I was going to make a bigger quilt, bigger size of this, I would, you would have to do that exactly what I did, mapping out your, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on and so forth. And this is how you determine how wide you can go, or how tall and wide, especially if you do a square. But clearly, plenty. And if you think about the fact that this, still have this to go, and 2 sleeves is about the size of a fat quarter. So that's a lot of fabric still to go. So that is how I figured that out. And I'm like, got it. Now, something to, just as a reminder, you know, if you like the scrappy and you don't have a whole entire shirt, you can do that, both the trip around the world and a 9-patch trip around the world, but you would have to be creative in where you put your kind of mismatching pieces if you wanted to go that way. I like a minimalistic look. You guys know this about me. And I want my fabrics to be uniform. For people who love the scrappy look and are okay with it being a little mismatchy, I mean, you could start this today and you wouldn't even really need to check and see if you have enough shirt fabric, because you can kind of use whatever. I would suggest, though, that I'm just talking like you're going to make this quilt. I hope you make this quilt along with me. But if you're doing this, what makes a trip around the world, to me, so great is the fact that you can see a defined ring for each row and column. And so if you do the scrappy route and you really want it to look like a trip around the world, you would obviously want to use similar colored or similar value fabrics. So yeah, so that's what I did. And now I'm just making it, and it's so fun, and I'm so excited. In the quilt that's forming behind me, I have had a doubt about the red to pink that's currently there. They are so similar to each other, not in the actual color, although maybe on screen it may look that way, but the value, so how dark it is, they're almost identical in how dark they are. But I know that we're going to this. So this is next, and then this. And so I'm hoping it's going to come out the way I imagine it will. But anyway, so this is my 9-patch trip around the world, kind of how I got here, where I'm going. Those of you that have been with me and are planning on staying with me, you'll see this one continue to develop, probably on the design wall behind me. Thank you for being with me. This is the Catbird Quilts, and I'm Kathy Martin. Thanks for watching. My roof. Blooper reel.